cover just a few things. Moving through the agenda, the first thing is really just taking a look at the facts. So what's going on at the moment and what are some of the emerging trends in the workplace? Secondly, as leaders, what are our current challenges but also our responsibilities? And then we're going to touch at a high level on what would be the three components of a psychological safety strategy and how do you roll that out. So what are the four levers of culture transformation, and we'll touch on some best practice case studies as we get towards the end of the presentation. Let me run through some facts, and I'm sure for many of you these are not new, but at a personal level, 25% of adult Australians were either on medication or seeing a physician for depression, stress, or anxiety. Now, I know we could argue that we prescribe too easily, and I'd buy into that, but it's more about a picture that starts to emerge over here. So it would be 1 in 4, and these are people that are showing up in our workplaces every single day. When it gets to the workplace, there's good news and there's bad news. A global survey by Gallup found that 60% of people around the world readily admit to coming to work and wasting up to 4 hours a day, every day, being unproductive. Now, they might work a 14 or a 16-hour day, but this is what people were saying in this anonymous survey of 15,000 people. The bad news for Australia is that it's 82%, so 8 out of 10 people. When we take a look at the big picture from a Medibank perspective, and this is the most quoted research, there's a new survey coming out, but stress-related claims have doubled from 1996 to 2004, and the World Health Organization has weighed in with a comment that by 2020, which is only 5 years away, depression will be the second most debilitating condition in the developed world. So we start thinking about what's happening in the workplace, and the Australian Psychological Society has reported that nearly half of all respondents reported workplace issues as a source of stress. It goes even further with the Australian Workplace Barometer of Psych Safety 2012, who have now labelled this a matter of national interest. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that this is not just a flavour of the month, it's actually a reality of our time. And if you look at the mental health spectrum, on the one end we have depression, stress, anxiety, and then it moves towards more clinical mental conditions. But I also think that people are just struggling with doing life, and it's showing up in the workplace. In terms of the Act, for the first time, health was defined to include psychological health, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. And really, at this point, it's up to organisations to decide what they will do to manage this risk. From a business perspective, workers' comp claims for mental stress increased 83% over a period of 7 years, and claims related to this type of stress are the most expensive in terms of time lost from work and obviously the financial cost of managing those as well. By the way, you will have access to the PowerPoint if you would like to keep the data. What is the cost? Well, Comcare tells us that the average total cost of mental stress claims, and this we're going to 2010-11, was approximately $191,000 per case, which is over 4 times that for all other claims. So I guess for leaders, who are caught between wanting to create workplaces where people are engaged, where they're productive and they're fulfilled, but trying to manage this at the same time, there are three key questions. The first question is, so where do you start? We're not all experts, but where do you start? The second question is, how do you know that it's working? And the third, I guess, from a legal perspective or a compliance perspective, is how do you know if what you're doing is enough? So I'm going to talk through the challenge just at 3 different levels, and again, at a high level, just touch on what are the legal obligations for us as leaders. How does that translate into culture and performance? And thirdly, how effective are the current attempts that we're making as organizations? I've often gone on record and on camera to say that I believe true psychological safety has been lost in what I call a fog of well-being incentives, which are all well-intended, but they're not connected and they're not strategic. And we have an Are You OK Day once a year, and I think there's some great information on that website. But a lot of people say, what about the other 364 days? Or I feel a bit weird asking somebody, "Are you okay?" on Are You OK Day. And what would happen if somebody answered and said, "No, I'm not," and went into some deeper issues? So the challenge for us as leaders is to make relevance and context of all this in a way that works. I know it feels a bit like speed dating, but there is a lot of stuff to cover. So I'm going to just jump to the first part of this is we spoke about legal and cultural. So from a legal perspective, let's take a look at three areas. So one is the Act, and no doubt, I'm not familiar with everyone in the audience, but no doubt you're all across this at different levels. Second is the notion of due diligence, and what does that really mean in terms of our responsibilities. And thirdly, this whole thing about early warning signs. So from the Act, things have changed and the bar has been set really high, and everyone is accountable. I think we're all familiar with that, with the changes that have happened in the Act. Secondly, there's a huge focus on consultation and cooperation like never before. So this is about providing evidence that we actually made sense of the procedures and policies that we have in place, and that people understood and that they had input into that. The focus again is quite high on eliminating or minimizing risk prior to an incident taking place. And organizations and leaders in particular, before they put their heads on their pillows, are probably thinking about, well, what would be the impact of stress claims, or the compensation or penalties, etc. What could be the damage to our employer brand? So there's a lot of risk that we need to manage, not just from a legal perspective, but extended risks there as well. And I'll talk a little bit later about a case study where a manager recently in New Zealand was actually convicted and fined, as was the organization, because an employee went off on mental stress leave. And the regulators are looking at what's happening in Australia, and could that be relevant as well. So this really has become quite high on our forefront. Just the notion of due diligence, and again, for some of you this is common news, for others maybe not so much, but the key things are the three elements to due diligence. And I think a lot of organizations do really well to have systems, processes, and procedures and policies when it comes to addressing psychological health and well-being in the workplace. But that in its own is not enough. What the courts really would like to know about is, how did you plan for this? How did you consult? How did you communicate? And even more important than that, how did you then monitor and review, which are two very, very different words. Monitor is going out and looking, and then reviewing is going, well, I've been monitoring and things are working really well, or they're not. I need to go back and change my systems and processes. Or maybe we need to do more consultation or more communication with our employees. So all three aspects of due diligence become quite critical when we put a strategy together around psychological safety in the workplace. I often talk about early warning signs, and for me this is really important. If you can imagine a timeline, and we're at 6 o'clock at the moment and nothing has happened, time passes until we hit 12 o'clock, and that's when we have our incident, and often it could be a physical injury or it could be a psychosocial injury. And of course time passes again as evidence is gathered and people are interviewed, and we end up on what is on the right hand side of the screen, JD, or let's call it Judgment Day. And of course the prosecutor would be looking backwards down the timeline, and they would have the benefit of hindsight. And with that benefit, of course, the words reasonable and practicable now become quite interesting. And so the question for me is really, way before 12 o'clock and way before the incident happens, there would be a series of early warning signs. And as leaders in organizations, I guess the two questions we need to ask ourselves are our people even looking for the early warning signs when it comes to psychological safety at work? Do they know what they are? I have a lot of data and documentation I can send you if you'd like on comprehensive lists of what the early warning signs could look like. But the second thing is, and if they were and they found them, what do they do with them? Because we're not psychologists, we don't know how to deal with this stuff. So how do we look at, kind of the way that people address early warning signs way before we get to the incident? And wouldn't it be great if we were that good at doing it, that 12 o'clock never happened at all? So the challenge from a legal perspective, of course, becomes two things. The first thing is detecting early warning signs. And the questions become, what did you know or ought you to have known as a leader? So what strategy, what systems, what policies did you have in place, etc.? How was that rolled out, thinking about due diligence, so that you were aware of what the early warning signs were? And post-awareness, the next question is then, what did you do? And did you do enough? And of course, when we're doing a full-day workshop, we talk about what does enough actually look like. Sending an email to somebody might not, in hindsight, have been enough if there could have been more that could have been done to prevent that injury. So I'm going to stop there on a legal perspective, but just again, the bar's been set very high. We all have an accountability, And it's really about, switching our people on to being aware of the early warning signs and knowing what to do with them or where to escalate them. Many organizations have an EAP program in place, which is fantastic, but when I'm running workshops and I, talk to participants and say, so tell me about your EAP, many of them would go, yeah, it's that thing on the website, or they're not really understanding of what it is, let alone how it works, how to use it, what's available. So if you're doing the due diligence test there, well, we can definitely tick the box that we've got one, but how well is it understood, and then how often are people using it, the monitor and review piece. I'd like to turn to the second, I guess, aspect of this, and that was from in our organizations, and I work a lot with academics around the world, and one is Sean Acker, who's a recognized academic. He wrote a book on happiness, besides doing a whole lot of leadership stuff, and I've written a book on happiness as well, which is really about dealing with depression, stress, and anxiety. But Sean wrote a white paper last year, and this is what he said. We put warning labels on smoking packs. Maybe we should put warnings on companies that have low social support. He then continues to say, and leaders have got it wrong. It's not about managers providing social support, but it's rather about switching team members onto the benefits they receive in providing social support to their peers. And for me, that's a critical piece. If we think about the world that we live in today, certainly the nature of work has changed when it comes to community and social support and awareness and noticing early warning signs in each other. We have fly-in, fly-out operations. We have people that work from home. We've got flexible working hours. We have technology in the workplace, and that's all had a huge impact on this notion of social support. I was coaching somebody recently, and it got to about Christmas time, and this particular lady was working in an IT company, over 100 people. It's a global business based in Melbourne. And I said, are you going to your Christmas party? And the answer, surprisingly, was no. And I said, well, that's really interesting. Why won't you go to your Christmas party? And her response was that, well, my team's not going, so I'm not going. And I said, but you've only got 5 people in your team, and you work on a floor of over 100 people. Surely you've got relationships with other people on your floor. And she just looked at me and went, no, I don't. I come to work every day. Everyone's got their earphones in their ears. God bless technology. It does a lot of good things, but it also zones people out. So I go into my cubicle and I work with my team, and then I go home. So I don't have any interaction with other people on the floor. In January, we had another conversation, and she was white-faced. And I said, what happened? And over the Christmas period, somebody else on the floor, one of the young chaps, had been killed in a car accident. And she said, I have been there for 4 years, and I have no idea what he looks like. And of course, the penny then dropped. And she said, and if something happened to me, nobody would know me. And in a coaching style, I said, so what could you do about that? And her answer was, well, you know what? I'm going to spend every day, just take 5 minutes getting to know people that I don't normally speak to on the floor. And when we talk about how the nature of work has changed and technology is impacting what we do, and people struggling with just doing life today, there are organizations out there that get this and that systematize it. So Zappos, for example, have 2 KPIs. One is for their managers. Managers have to spend 20% of their time talking to staff about non-work-related issues, and team members need to spend 10% of their time interacting with team members in other departments and other teams. And of course, when it comes to their annual review, if they're not doing it, they don't get punished, they get coached and they get mentored into understanding, why that is so important. So the notion of social support in the workplace becomes really interesting, especially with the way that life and business has changed. I'm often out, as I love being, in small rural and regional areas, and I'm dealing with the blokes on the tools, and I'll hear things like, mate, we used to in the old days have a beer after work and spend some time, and you'd look at your mate and he wasn't looking at himself, and you go, mate, what's going on? And you go, well, actually, I'm having a bit of trouble with a wife, or I'm having this. We've taken those opportunities today for providing social support. So Sean Acker, who's really a leader and a thought leader in the space, is really strong about it not being about managers or leaders, but it's really switching team members onto the benefits they receive from providing social supports to their peers, which is really interesting because for those of you in this call who are safety experts, Patrick Hudson, who I guess is the doyen of safety culture evolution, you'd be familiar with this model about how organizations mature over time from pathological through reactive to calculative, then proactive, and eventually generative. And what's really interesting in Patrick's words, he says at the generative level, there is no real work for leaders because peers take care of the safety of peers. So on the one hand, we have the leadership expert talking about social support and peers taking care of peers. And on the other hand, we've got Patrick Hudson, who's the expert in the safety perspective, saying the same thing. So for me, there's a kind of intersection between these two thoughts of leadership, and there's a sweet spot that sits right in the middle there, and it's about creating social support in the workplace, which then translates into understanding and looking for the early warning signs and dealing with them. So I'm going to move on to the second part of the presentation, which is really a psychological safety strategy, and I strongly believe that culture is culture. I don't think we need to separate, safety culture from organizational culture. It is all just about people at the end of the day. But when it comes to psychological safety, I do believe we need a strategic standalone strategy that is robust and meets the tests of, for example, due diligence, etc. And I look at three elements. So when you look at a psychological safety framework, there are three parts to this. We need to look at leaders creating organizations that are psychologically safe. And that really is a leadership function, but it needs to be co-created with employees. And I've got some definitions coming up on the next slides. Psychologically fit, well, that's the employee responsibility, and we unfortunately can't leave it to employees only, but how can the employee come to work or the team member come to work in a fit state and able to manage not just the stress of work, but also the stress of doing life outside of work? And if there are gaps there, what can we as an organization do to assess and fill those gaps? The third part of the psychological safety framework for me is then psychologically thriving. And this is a situation where teams, a bit like generative teams in Hudson's world, but there's a high level of trust, which is one of his drivers, and a high level of vulnerability. And teams here just thrive. They're constantly learning. They're pretty happy to be vulnerable and open with each other. And I'll share a few case studies later of psychologically thriving teams that achieve great results. A lot of people would say, is this a linear model? And it could be. But if you think about it for a moment, where organizations are in a space where teams are thriving and then circumstances in the environment changes, if they don't have psychological safety at work and aren't personally psychologically fit, what happens then? So I do think the three are very strongly connected. The second element of creating a psychological safety strategy really looks at, for me, the four levers of culture transformation. And they are having a specific strategy with a very, very clear purpose, where the context is understood and everybody makes sense of it. And of course, there is a lot of measurement as to what you're doing. So just to sum up for me, a psychologically safe environment is really where employees feel both mentally and emotionally safe. The organization has specific policies in place to support and enable this, which are actively embedded, and leaders lead with care and consequence and are held accountable for their behaviors. And there's a huge importance here about the balance between care and consequence that I'll touch on in one of the case studies. Psychologically fit, well, this is where employees take ownership of their own personal psychological fitness. They have the insights and the skills to manage this, and the organization ensures that these skills are developed if there are gaps. And as I said earlier, psychologically thriving teams, these are teams that thrive as a result of individuals feeling safe and fit, and there is tangible evidence of active social support, high transparency, and trust. The next part for me is obviously, well, where do you start? As an organization, and given the time constraints that we have today, I have attached a copy of a psychological safety survey which looks at the three areas of safe, fit, and thriving. And I just want to advise that I guess it's for your reading and interest only at the moment. Should you want to do this with an organization, it does require a fair bit of context and framing around that as well. But as a takeaway from today, please feel free to take this home and reflect. And if you battle to download it, give us a call. We'd be happy to send that through to you. The third piece I was looking at today is the four levers of culture transformation. And again, they are being very, very clear on a strategy and knowing what that means. Purpose and context. It's fascinating for me the number of times I talk to employees where a new strategy has been rolled out and they have no idea why. There's no sense making around it, and so it's very hard for them to buy into it. And often what they do is they just duck under the water and hope that this wave's going to roll over and, you know, wait for the CEO to read the next book and come out with the next strategy. So real clarity around purpose and ensuring that there is an engagement and an alignment of purpose becomes really important, as does the context. The third element really is around actions, expectations, and consequences. And from a leadership perspective, it's really important that people understand, well, what do you want me to do? You know, what am I required to do as part of the strategy? What are the expectations? But also, what are the consequences of non-participation? And often I look at leaders who kind of shy away a little bit from that one. And I'm reminded of my time with John McFarlane when he got his top 300 together and had a conversation with them as to where the organization was going in terms of this massive rollout globally, which was a huge investment. And he was pretty open and said, look, here are the actions, expectations, but here are the consequences of non-participation as well. And if this doesn't sit with you and you're not comfortable, you're welcome to leave with my blessing. But should you choose to stay, then this is how we're going to play. So I think, again, it's an important part of the culture transformation process, and I can't stop stressing the measurement, see how we're tracking with that. Again, conscious of time, I'm just going to jump into a few case studies and have a bit of a conversation. I was very fortunate when I was in Denmark to meet with Alex Kirov, who, well, he calls himself the Chief Happiness Officer of a company called Woohoo Inc., which is a Danish organization. He speaks globally, was the CEO of a large IT company. But he really asked a question, I guess, that ties into psychological safety as well. And the question is around what makes people happy at work. And if you really think about that question, there are really two elements to that. Number one is results. People want to know that they're achieving, they want to see results, they want to achieve results, etc. But the second part is relationships. And it's the relationships they have not only with themselves, but also relationships with other people at work. And what fascinates me is that, you know, as organizations, if people aren't achieving results, well, we invest huge time and money in that. We coach them, we mentor them, we send them on time management courses, we do whatever we can to help them with their results. But how much time and effort do we actually invest in relationships, which is a 50% contributor to workplace happiness? I'm going to touch on a few very, very brief case studies, and naturally there are heaps, you know, in a full one-day program, and I have resources available as well. But in the time that we have, let's just look at safe, fit, and thriving. So when we talk about psychologically safe leadership, what does that mean to you? And why would people follow leaders on this journey? For those of you who do watch TED videos, I'd recommend you watch a video by Simon Sinek, and there is a reference there to him. And pretty much he speaks about, if we go back to our primal days, you know, tribes only survived by doing a few things. So you can imagine that, you know, there is danger from all sides in the caveman times, and as a tribe, what kept people safe and ensured our survival were the two things called trust and cooperation. And it was the leader who set the tone for that to happen. In the modern world, nothing's changed. You know, the workplace, your workplace, all workplaces every day have this danger. We're being attacked by competitors. We're being attacked by changing resource prices, social media, technology. There's all this danger and threat on the outside. And the only way that as organizations we can really survive and thrive is, again, through these elements of trust and cooperation. And it was Simon Sinek where I got the quote about leaders setting the tone and leading with care and consequence, and finding the balance between those two. When you look at leadership, I mean, that's displayed. And here's another reference, the Barry Ware story. This is an organization in the States that lost 25% of their business overnight. They're a manufacturing company. And the board made a decision that the only way to deal with this was to reduce headcount. The CEO said no. He said, I know my people, I understand this culture. And he went to the organization and was very transparent about what had happened, what the impact was on the business. And he said, I have another solution. If every person in this organization took 2 weeks leave unpaid, we wouldn't have to retrench anybody. And the type of leader that he was and how he communicated that message led to the next most amazing thing. People started to negotiate and contract and talk with each other, and those who could afford it took 10, 12, 14 weeks of unpaid leave so that the single mum who was struggling didn't have to take any leave whatsoever. The impact on the business at that time is that they'd lost, they need to find $10 million. What happened as a consequence of that story is nobody got retrenched, and they didn't find $10 million in savings, they found 20. Now, can you imagine the stories that are told around the barbecue about working in a place like that? And again, this has a lot to do with the leadership, but also the level of cultural maturity. When we talk about being psychologically fit, again, I believe that all interventions really need to match the level of cultural maturity of the organization. Contemplation for me is a big one, and in a number of areas they are now saying contemplation is the new caffeine. And when do people get to really look within? So organizations like Google will run mindfulness lunches, and there are areas in time and space set aside for contemplation. The program they run is called the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Program, which is run by a number, as you can see, of leading organizations as well. And it's really interesting when you listen to the comments of participants. For example, one participant said, my strategy for dealing with mental stress in the old days used to be bourbon and pizza, but today it's around mindfulness. Now, in your organization, you might need to look at something else that might be a fit, because it depends on your industry. And it's all about, though, for me, the big picture, which is the principle of what is it that we can do to help people become psychologically fit for work. If you think for a moment about fatigue and stress, I'm currently working with an organization called Circadian, and I was unaware until about 6 months ago that if you're sleep deprived, you actually show up for work with the equivalent of 0.05 or 0.08, which would be the blood alcohol reading. What kind of decisions can you make when you're in that space? And how does it impact your relationships and the interactions you have with others? So for me, when you start looking at beyond drugs and alcohol, but just fatigue, depression, anxiety, how do we help people manage themselves to become more psychologically fit? There are a couple of references there to some online programs. Again, the evidence speaks for itself, and I deal with the CEO of Be Intent in New Zealand. Really interesting that surveying over 9,000 staff in 12 industries across Australia, there's a high level of fatigue, tiredness, and stress. And in a very short space of time, through an intervention where people were managing their own personal fitness, as you can see, the indicators shifted really highly in the organization. In fact, one team, when you take a look at the dark orange line, their positive states, as relating to the tiredness going down, and their negative states, they were able to achieve amazing results. I mentioned earlier the notion of psychologically thriving, and the Harvard Business Review recently ran an article on deliberately developmental organizations. And these are organizations that look at turning employees' personal struggles into growth opportunities, and they're actually discovering a new kind of competitive advantage. You'll notice in the psychological safety survey, there are a number of elements there that you can have a look at if you download it. But these are teams that have reached that level of maturity, I guess, trust and vulnerability, that people reveal their inadequacies, their fears, their failures, their anxieties. In fact, they're expected to do that, and their peers will call them on it if they're not doing it. They have issues logs, and they actually report that. And again, problems and failures are actually applauded by others. Technology creeps in here. There's a pay and button app, so if you come to work feeling a little bit cynical or negative or grumpy or the rest of it, put it out there. When they develop new capabilities, they actually advertise those so they can mentor others. And here's the big kicker: performance reviews are public. So again, the question of what degree of trust have you reached where you can make this happen, and we do a lot of work in the space of helping teams develop trust and develop vulnerability. Some of the quotes that come from the article are things like, if people must be vulnerable in order to grow, they need a community that will make them feel safe. And the values that really drive this are accountability, transparency, and support. And then from an employee, experiencing yourself as incomplete or inadequate, but still included, accepted, and valued. So I've tried to touch on just a couple of high points, and I'm conscious that we don't have too much time in our seminar or webinar today. But if I could just summarize, I guess, when you start talking about psychological safety in the workplace, there are a few things that are important to me. Number one, it needs to be a specific standalone strategy, and it needs to fulfill the criteria of due diligence and measurement. Detection and prevention for me are far better and obviously less risky and costly than cure. It's about leadership setting the pace for creating an environment of social support. And I can't say often enough that your psychological safety strategy really needs to match your level of cultural maturity. So we've gone 35 minutes, and I really would like to thank you for just this introduction. Obviously, as Generative HSE, We're receiving a lot of inquiries to work with organizations, whether that be keynotes, conference addresses, or one-day program, or slightly longer interventions. And I'm really delighted that you took some time out today to join us. So I would assume that you're all on mute, but we do have 10 minutes for questions, so I'd like to throw that open to you.
If there are no questions coming through there, Pete, I might take the opportunity to thank you. It's Christy McGrath from Generative HSE. It's an important topic, close to many of our hearts, and I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank you for your constructive and practical advice that we can all take to our workplaces, and some great examples of what's happening in this space. So thank you very much for that, Pete. For all the participants.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to all the participants today. We appreciate you taking the time to join us. If you've enjoyed today, can I encourage you to jump onto the Generative HSE website? This is part of a whole Lunch and Learn webinar series. So if you've enjoyed your time, please take a look and see if there's any other topics that are of interest to you. We've got a number of speakers that are joining us over the next couple of months, and no doubt you'll find them relevant as well. So please do that. And thanks again, Pete, for your time. We really appreciate it.
No worries. I did have one thing in my back pocket, anticipating questions, and if someone's actually downloaded the PowerPoint, there are a few slides there, and if you're still, I can see who's still in the conference. I might just take a quick 5 minutes and talk through an organization called Zappos. Now, they might work in a different industry to yours, but a lot of the principles are the same. So at a very high level, Zappos has been one of the Fortune Top 100 best companies to work for 6 years in a row. They entered in 23rd spot in 2009 and have held that position. They are an organization that sell shoes, jewelry, footwear. It's very much an online type organization. But here's the big thing. They grew from 1.2 million turnover to 1.2 billion in just 8 years. And the CEO of the organization, who'd sold an IT business earlier, and funnily enough, when he sold his business and decided to be an angel investor, he said, you know, the business that I built, that I sold for a couple of $100 million, I hated working there. I hated the people. I hated the environment. I was going to do something different with Zappos. And Zappos is quoted in so much of the media. And there are a couple of things that are really important. Here's the first one. Induction takes 4 weeks. So when you join the organization, people are really clear on understanding why you want to work there and talking about what drives you and understanding your purpose and understanding the culture and what's important. But to take that to the next level, they're so strong on their culture and cultural fit that they'll often pay staff $2,000 to leave. So you can imagine these are call center operators earning $11 an hour. $2,000 is a lot of hours, but Zappos is that strong on the fit in terms of the culture. They'll go, look, you actually don't fit here. Here's $2,000 to kind of tide you over, you know, as you move on to find something else. 50% of their performance review rating is based on culture. They have a belief that, you know, if someone's doing a bad job, why would you wait a year to tell them? Or if someone's doing a good job, why would you wait a year to tell them? So they're rather focused not on so much on the numbers, but on how they're living the cultural values and the cultural principles of the organization. They have personal coaching on how they sustain their personal happiness, and to me that falls quite strongly into the psychologically fit. So helping employees manage their own happiness and psychological fitness. All managers are required, as I said earlier, to spend 10% of their time with employees talking about non-business related stuff, and they've systematized that employees need to spend time talking with other employees and other teams and departments. Here's an interesting one. Pay raises can only be achieved through acquiring skill sets. This is really looking at the two drivers of happiness, results and relationships. And human beings are programmed for growth and development. And they looked at the early days where it took 18 months to progress through the ranks in the organization. That's a long time. And they've cut that course into 3 6-month periods with small little increments and pay rises as you achieve things. They're also okay if people don't want to learn or acquire skill sets. But that's just the way that they do things there as an organization. And staff determine their own self-improvement pace. What really makes their happiness framework so strong is that people have a sense of control, so they can perceive they have control in their own future and destiny. They have a sense of or a perception of their own progress at the pace that they choose to. They have an incredibly strong focus on connection, which again ties up with that sweet spot of social support that I was talking about earlier when you talk about Accor and Patrick Hudson. And they've created a meaningful vision for the organization, and no surprises that they've managed to grow and kick such goals. So I thought I'd just quickly talk through that because I had that in my back pocket just in case. And if you'd like to Google Zappos, there'd be a whole lot of stuff there as well. So thank you very much again for your time, and we'd be happy to have further conversations if you were to contact Generative HSE. So thank you very much, and thank you, Christy, for the invitation.
Thanks, Pete.